Tom Cruise stopped mid-sentence, not at the end of a thought, not at a natural pause. In the middle of a word, his mouth open, the sound simply ceasing the way a radio ceases when someone pulls the power, completely, without warning, without wind down. His head turned, not toward Jimmy, not toward the audience, toward the back of the studio, toward the corridor that runs behind the left side cameras, where a sound had just come from that nobody had planned for and nobody had announced. A voice, old, female, singing. Barely above a whisper, but caught, somehow caught, perfectly by the overhead microphones that the sound team had been about to cut for the next segment. Tom Cruise's mouth closed. His eyes moved across the back of the room with the slow, stunned precision of a man trying to locate something he had been certain he would never hear again. Jimmy Fallon watched his face and could not speak. 300 people in that studio held their breath. And the voice kept singing, thin and clear and absolutely certain of every note, from somewhere in the dark at the back of the room. It was a Thursday evening in September 2024. The Tonight Show, starring Jimmy Fallon. Tom Cruise was the guest, in New York for the press circuit on a new film, appearing on the show because Tom Cruise always appeared on the show, because the combination of him and Jimmy produced the kind of television that audiences watched twice. He was 62 years old, and he walked onto that stage the way he walked onto every stage, at a slight forward lean, as if the next thing were already pulling him toward it. The particular physical confidence of a man who has spent 4 decades trusting his body with tasks that would terrify most people. The audience had erupted. The interview was electric. Tom was loose, telling stories, laughing hard, the famous charm operating at full power. Then Jimmy had said there was something he needed Tom to listen to. He had not explained further. He had simply nodded to someone off stage. And from the corridor behind the left side cameras, a sound had begun. Not loud, not dramatic, just a voice, an old woman's voice, singing a melody that was not from any recent decade, the kind of melody that belongs to a particular era of American music, church-warm, plain-spoken, built for carrying across distance. The kind of voice that has been singing so long it has stopped performing entirely and become something else. Something true. Tom Cruise heard 4 notes and stopped speaking. His hands, which had been moving with the easy expressiveness of a born storyteller, went still on the armrests of his chair. His head turned, his eyes swept the back of the studio. Jimmy watched his face move through something that had no name in the professional vocabulary of a talk show, something that lived entirely outside the frame of celebrity and interview and performance, in the unguarded territory that a person's face occupies only when they have been caught completely off guard by something they love. Jimmy did not say a word. He sat with his hands folded on his desk, and he let the voice do what it was doing. The entire studio froze. The cameras pivoted slowly toward the back of the room. A stagehand near the camera platform had stopped moving and was standing with a cable looped over one arm, listening. The floor director, headset on, had taken 1 step backward as if creating space for something. In the 4th row, a man in his 70s was gripping the armrest of his seat and staring at the back corridor with an expression that said he recognized something he could not explain. Was this rehearsed? The audience could not tell. It did not feel rehearsed. It felt like the opposite of rehearsed, like something that had been waiting for years to find its moment, had simply decided that tonight was the night. Tom Cruise's jaw moved once, without producing sound. His mouth opened and closed. He was trying to form a word, and the word would not come. He turned to Jimmy, and his eyes, the eyes that had carried 1,000 movie posters, that had stared down cameras for 40 years with total and practiced command, were searching, uncertain, somewhere between 20 years old and 62, all at once. "Jimmy," he said, and then nothing more. Just his name, just the one word. As if naming the host was the only fixed point available to him in that moment. Then, barely above a whisper, so close to silence that the microphone almost lost it entirely. "That's Lorraine." To understand what happened on that stage in September 2024, you need to understand what happened in the summer of 1981. Tom Cruise wasn't always Tom Cruise, icon and legend. In 1981, he was 19 years old, and he had been in New York for 11 months, living on almost nothing in a shared apartment in Hell's Kitchen with two other young actors who were also living on almost nothing. He had done one film, a small role, barely a scene, and the role had not led to anything yet. He was auditioning constantly and waiting constantly, and filling the space between auditions with a specific kind of determined, low-grade anxiety that belongs to young people who have committed to something enormous and have not yet received confirmation that the commitment was not a mistake. He worked part-time at a restaurant on 44th Street, clearing tables, and he trained every morning before his shift because the training was the one thing he could control when everything else was entirely out of his hands. That summer, he had a handful of friends, real ones. Not the networking variety, not the industry-adjacent kind, but the kind you make when you are young and broke and living in a city that is indifferent to your ambitions, and you are all in it together. Among them was a young woman named Carla Shepard, 22 years old, studying at the Actors Studio on a partial scholarship she had won out of Georgia. She was from a small town outside Savannah, the kind of town where everybody knew each other's business, and the church was the center of the social world, and music was not entertainment, but the structure underneath daily life. She had grown up singing in her grandmother's church choir from the age of 5, and she sang the way people sing when it has been part of them that long, without effort, without display, as naturally as breathing. They met at an open call in June. Both had arrived 2 hours early and ended up sitting on the steps outside the building for 45 minutes before the doors opened. She was reading a paperback. He was running lines in his head and pretending he wasn't nervous. She had seen through this immediately and offered him half of her sandwich, which he had accepted, and they had talked until the doors opened and kept talking afterward, through the callback that neither of them got, and through the coffee they got after that to take the edge off the rejection. They became close quickly, the way young people become close when they are sharing the same experience of being terrified and certain simultaneously. They rehearsed scenes together in the apartment, gave each other notes, talked about their work with a seriousness that only people who have not yet achieved anything can bring to discussions of their craft, urgently, without irony, as if each conversation were building toward something. Carla was the better actor at that point, technically. Tom knew it, and she knew it, and it was not a point of tension between them because they had the kind of friendship in which both people's success was something they rooted for with genuine equality. But what Tom remembered most, from that summer, was the singing. Carla sang when she was cooking, which was often because she cooked for both of them most evenings in the apartment of a friend they used as a gathering place. She sang while she washed dishes. She sang fragments of hymns under her breath during long subway rides, not performing, just keeping herself company the way people hum. And once, on a Saturday evening in August, when a group of them had gathered in Riverside Park and the city had gone quiet the way it very occasionally goes quiet in summer, she had sung for real, a hymn she'd learned from her grandmother, something old and southern and completely unself-conscious, sitting cross-legged on the grass in the early dark with the Hudson behind her. Tom had listened without moving. He had never heard anyone sing like that outside of a recorded context. not with that ease, that certainty, that particular quality of a voice that is not performing for a listener, but is simply being what it is. He told her afterward, stumbling over the words the way he stumbled over words when he meant something absolutely, that it was the most purely beautiful thing he had ever heard in person. She had looked at him and laughed and said, "It's just what my grandmother taught me. It's nothing I did." He had told her, "That's exactly what makes it what it is." By October, his career had begun its rapid and permanent acceleration. The opportunities arrived quickly once they started arriving, and they pulled him in directions that required his complete attention. He left New York for Los Angeles in November. Carla stayed, continued training, continued auditioning. They stayed in touch through the first year, then through the early years of his rising. And then the touch became lighter and less frequent in the way that the touch of young friendships becomes lighter when the lives diverge sharply and there is no longer a shared geography of experience. By 1985, they had lost the thread entirely, not through any event, simply through the distance that very different velocities of living create between people who were once moving at the same speed. Tom had thought about Carla Shepard many times. He had thought about her during the years when the fame was new and disorienting, and he would have given a great deal for a conversation with someone who knew him before any of it. He had thought about her when he heard certain kinds of music, the unadorned, church-playing kind, the kind that has no arrangement underneath it, just a voice and the room. He had tried, twice, in the 90s, to locate her through the industry contacts that had replaced the address book of his youth. He had found nothing. The particular Carla Shepard he was looking for had not become famous, which meant she had not left the kind of trail that famous people leave, and the world before the internet offered no other kind of trail to follow. He had not found her. He had stopped looking eventually, the way you stop looking for something you have accepted is beyond your reach. But he had never stopped hearing, in certain kinds of silence, the echo of a voice in Riverside Park on a Saturday evening in August 1981, singing something her grandmother had taught her. Subscribe and leave a comment because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Behind the scenes, the connection had been made not by a family member and not through a letter, but through a woman named Denise Okafor, 67 years old, a retired social worker in Atlanta who had been Carla Shepard's roommate at a women's residential facility in the late 1980s. When Carla had gone through a period of serious difficulty that eventually resolved and left her stronger. Denise had stayed in touch with Carla across the decades. She knew that Carla, now 65 years old, lived in Macon, Georgia, and had been, for 30 years, the music director of a Baptist church with a congregation of 400 families. She knew that Carla had never had a significant acting career, that the path had closed, the way paths close, and she had found a different path that suited her more completely than she could have imagined at 22. She knew that Carla talked sometimes, quietly, about a summer in New York when she had been young and ambitious and had known a handful of people who were going to become very different kinds of people than she became. She never used the names. She had too much grace for that. Denise had watched a documentary about Tom Cruise's early years in New York. She had heard him describe, briefly and without naming anyone, a summer when a friend in Riverside Park had sung something that rearranged how he understood what real performance was. She had recognized what he was describing. She had written to his production company the following morning. Tom had been told about the letter 6 weeks before the September taping. He had called Carla directly, reaching her through Denise on a Sunday afternoon when Carla was between the morning and evening services at her church. She had answered a number she did not recognize, and when she heard who was on the line, she had sat down in the front pew without meaning to, and stayed there for the rest of the call. They had talked for an hour and 40 minutes. Tom had done very little talking. He had mostly listened. Carla had eventually laughed and said, "You're the same. You were always a better listener than you let on." What Tom had arranged with the Tonight Show producers was this. Carla Shepard would be brought to New York for the taping. She would be positioned in the corridor behind the left side cameras, out of sight. At a prearranged moment in the interview, she would begin singing the same hymn, the one from Riverside Park, the one she had learned from her grandmother. Just the first verse. No microphone, no amplification, just her voice in a corridor. The way a voice sounds when it is not performing for anyone, but is simply being what it is. The producers had placed a single overhead microphone in the corridor at the lowest possible gain, not to amplify, but to capture. Tom had not told the producers what to expect from himself when he heard it. He had not been certain he knew. Now the voice in the corridor had been singing for 12 seconds. Tom Cruise had not moved. He was sitting in his chair with both hands on the armrests, and his face had crossed through confusion and disbelief and recognition, and arrived somewhere beyond all three, somewhere that had no name in the landscape of a professional talk show, somewhere that belonged entirely to a Saturday evening in August, 43 years ago. Jimmy leaned forward. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Tom, you okay?" Tom did not answer immediately. He was breathing carefully, the way a person breathes when they are trying to stay level against something that is pulling them sideways. Then he looked at Jimmy. His mouth moved. Nothing came out. He tried again. "Where is she?" he said. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. Jimmy stood up from his desk. He walked around it to where Tom was sitting. He extended his hand. Tom looked at it. Then he took it, and Jimmy pulled him to his feet, not dramatically, just practically, the way you help a person stand when they need a moment to find their legs. And he walked him off the set, down the steps at the side of the stage, through the studio floor, past 300 people who were completely silent and completely still, toward the corridor behind the left side cameras. Carla Shepard was still singing when they reached the entrance to the corridor. She was standing with her hands folded in front of her, eyes closed, the way she had always sung, not performing, just being what she was. She was 65 years old, and she was wearing a blue dress and low heels, and she had the bearing of someone who has spent 30 years leading 400 families through the music of their lives. She did not know they were there until she finished the verse and opened her eyes. Tom Cruise was standing 6 feet away, and he was not speaking. "Carla," he said. And then he said nothing else, because there was nothing else that needed to be said. And he had never been a person who filled silence with words when silence was doing better work. She looked at him for a long moment. "You're older," she said. "So are you. I look better, though." He laughed. It came out broken and real, the laugh of a person who has just been returned to something they had given up finding, and it echoed in the corridor, and the studio microphones caught it, and 300 people in the audience heard it and laughed too, shakily, through their own tears. She reached into the small bag she carried and removed something. A photograph. Small, worn at the edges in the particular way of photographs that have been handled many times. She held it out to him. He took it. He looked at it. A group of young people on the grass in Riverside Park. Summer. One of them cross-legged at the center, laughing at something off-camera, 19 years old, not yet anyone the world knew about. Another sitting beside her, head thrown back, just as young, just as unknown. On the back, in handwriting he did not recognize as hers at first, and then did, completely. August 1981. Before everything, when we were just us. Tom looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he looked up. His eyes were steady. His voice, when it came, was quiet and absolutely direct. I heard you sing in Riverside Park, and I understood for the first time what it meant to do something without protecting yourself. That's what I've been chasing in every role I've ever played. He paused. I needed you to know that I knew where it came from. Carla Shepard pressed her hand flat against his chest. Once. The way you press your hand against something to confirm it is solid and real. Then she straightened up and looked at him with the full, unhurried attention of a woman who had been paying that quality of attention to people for 65 years. You learned it, she said. I just showed you the door. The standing ovation that followed was not immediate. It built slowly, from the back. From people who had been holding something tightly and needed a moment to release it before their hands were free to do anything else. When it arrived, it was total, all 300 people on their feet. And Jimmy Fallon stood at the entrance to the corridor with his hands pressed together in front of his face. Not applauding, just present, just witnessing in the way that he had told his audience he was here to be. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Carla Shepard returned to Macon, Georgia, 2 days after the taping. Her congregation had watched the broadcast together in the church fellowship hall on a Sunday evening. And when the corridor scene aired, the room went completely quiet in the way that rooms full of people go quiet when they are collectively experiencing something they did not expect to feel. Afterward, 2 of her younger choir members told her it was the most beautiful thing they had ever seen on television. She told them it was just an old friendship finding its way home. They told her that was exactly what made it beautiful. Tom has a copy of the Riverside Park photograph now, reproduced from the original that Carla kept. It is not framed. It is in his wallet, behind his driver's license, the way important things are kept when you want them close, rather than displayed. He has not spoken about it publicly beyond the night of the taping. He does not need to. Carla still leads the 400 families of her congregation through the music of their lives every Sunday. She still sings with her eyes closed, without amplification, the way her grandmother taught her. Not performing for a listener, but simply being what she is. She always was. That was always the whole of it. Some voices teach you what performing really means by never performing at all. And some lessons live in you for 40 years before you find the person you learned them from and can finally say, I know. I always knew. Thank you.